Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, just another talking head video from the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute. And as always, I greatly appreciate your support and being a part of this channel and sending your questions along and supporting all my little projects that I work on. I was going to mention, because I keep forgetting to promote it all the time, and I don't know why I do this, but if you have not seen it yet, make sure you check out the Switzerland County Absinthe documentary that myself and Brian Cushing from the Victorian Barroom did. It is available on YouTube on the Victorian Barroom channel right now. And it's a really cool documentary. We really delve deep into the history of distilling in Switzerland County, Indiana, and how absinthe was being made there in the 1830s, which is several decades before it catches on anywhere outside of the Swiss Alps and northern France. We even recreated said absinthe from scratch using yeast that we actually collected in Switzerland County at Musée de Venoge, and using botanicals from both Musée de Venoge, my property, and also Locust Grove Farm Distillery in Louisville, Kentucky. It's a really cool documentary. It'd mean a lot if you went and checked it out, and I think you'd learn a lot about the history of distilling in the state of Indiana if you did check it out, as well as some of the history of absinthe production. So, as always, check out thealchemistcabinet.com, and you can pick up your copy of the Practical Distiller's Almanac. We do have more copies on their way right now. We're going to offer that for a little bit longer, but of course, it being an almanac of sorts for the year of 2024, you know, we're not going to offer it all year round, because some of the information will become less useful as the year goes on. You know, I'm going to do one of these every single year. In fact, I started on that in earnest today with an article that I'm doing for my presentation coming up at the Alembic Lodge. That's a Alembic Freemasons Lodge in Cincinnati here very soon. And that information that's in there about esoteric distilling is very close to my heart, and that'll probably be the article that starts off the 2025 Practical Distiller's Almanac that I'm working on now. So I feel like I just talked myself in a circle there. Anyways, you can also buy copies of Volume 1 and Volume 2, my other two distillation-related books, on that site. And I'll be doing a lot more writing in the near future. Something I've learned that I have a passion for, something that I really enjoy. And although my grammar and my spelling are not the best in the world, I feel like I'm a fairly decent writer, even if I do need a lot of editing. Just read them like Ginsberg's books, right? There's no real sentence structure, paragraph structure, or anything like that. But the important part is, did you get the information? Because you got the information. It's fine. Anyways, got a few questions here today, and I might be able to do them all in one video, actually. And I think that that's okay, because I like these videos, you know, to be 10, 15 minutes, but I like them to be jam-packed full of information that might help you guys. And I got a couple great questions that came through via email. And you guys can send your questions at to bishopshomegrown@gmail.com on my social media or in the YouTube comments below. And if I miss one, please try another method of getting it to me. I will do my best to answer your question to the best of my ability with the knowledge that I have at hand. So, first question from Floyd. So, Alan, when I make some mashes, I will use bread yeast and blackberry yeast. I take blackberries and a spoonful of sugar with water, place the ingredients in a mason jar, then add blackberries for 4 days until I see yeast movement. Do you ever get your yeast using this method? I put the bread yeast and blackberry yeast in at the same time. Should I stagger this process? I love the videos. Thanks for the forum to chat about it. P.S. What was your first recipe? We'll start with a P.S. I think my first recipe was probably just a simple sugar shine with corn, if I remember correctly. And not knowing what I was doing, I kind of messed that up. So, you know, that's the nature of the beast, especially when you're 15 years old. So that's the earliest one I can remember anyways. But on to your questions here. So I have gathered yeast from blackberries, specifically if those blackberries are in a place where there used to be an old distillery at, and I suspect there's an alcohol-tolerant yeast there. But I've also gathered, quote-unquote, wild yeast from blackberries. The way that I tend to do it is to basically take as many blackberries as I can fit into some sterilized sugar water with about a 1050 specific gravity, and let that yeast get up and going. If I'm going to do it with a wild yeast, though, where I know there's not been a distillery around or something, I do start with a very small amount of sugar. You can actually adapt those wild yeasts to get to higher and higher alcohol tolerance over several generations. So in other words, start up like I've told you guys how to capture yeast before, with a low specific gravity. The next time that you make another yeast starter with that yeast, go to a little higher gravity, then a little higher, and a little higher. and see how high you can get that yeast to go to. You can actually make it alcohol tolerant by selection that way, because most likely you don't just have one yeast organism, but multiple yeast organisms within that matrix, and you can specifically select what you want to produce higher alcohols. So yes, I've definitely done that. And the other thing that I've mentioned here, one of my favorite candidates for gathering yeast from, and this was actually one of the favorites of the old timers as well, specifically even legal distillers and brewers after Prohibition ended. They had to get a yeast strain back, and a lot of them would go around and they would find old apple trees or crab apple trees. That film on that apple, just like on grapes, is yeast. And typically those are almost always alcohol tolerant yeast that make good quality product. So I have gathered a lot of yeast off of crab apples and full-sized apples over the years, grapes, blackberries, you name it, I've probably done it. In fact, the 2 Pennsylvania yeast that we brought back, or that I brought back, that were gathered with Eric Wolf and myself out at Stolen Wolf Distillery from the old Becker Distillery and the old Kaufman Distillery. The Becker Distillery, they were just some branches that were just broken off, some twigs that were broken off on the bank next to where the old distillery was, and had no problem getting a great yeast strain off that is fully alcohol tolerant, at least up to 9 or 10% alcohol. So went great. Now, I would say, if I were you, I would not pitch both those yeasts at the same time, because what's going to happen is that bread yeast is for sure tolerant of alcohol. It also, because you're pitching a commercial bread yeast, you're getting more initial yeast cells than what you're actually getting from the blackberry that you're starting as well. My suspicion is that what happens is that bread yeast is probably taking over that blackberry yeast. If you're going to do anything, I would start that blackberry yeast first and either let it ride the whole time or let it go for a couple days and then pitch the bread yeast. Then you'll get the effect of both of those yeast strains, presumably. And that's presuming that bread yeast actually kills out that blackberry yeast. The reason what I do at Spirits of French Lick works is because that yeast that I use the second day, that brandy yeast, that's a competitive factor yeast. And what's happened is in the cook that I do on day one, the yeast gets going hard enough and fast enough that it starts to drop the pH. When I take that second cook and put it on top of it with a new yeast, that new yeast, which is a brandy yeast, is used to that lower pH. It stalls out the existing bread yeast to the extent that the brandy yeast that I've added on the second day blooms, and that bread yeast can't keep up with it. So it eats it out of existence, basically. It outcompetes it. So hopefully that answered your question. I have had some great results with some yeast gathered from blackberries in the past, though. I should also mention that. So moving on to some questions from my buddy Bob down in Costa Rica. So who says, I sent this question quite a while ago and I may have missed it, or you missed it, or you didn't think it was a good question for the channel. If you already answered it, my apologies. Bob, they've all been good questions, buddy. Sometimes I do miss them. And I will say, when I read this, I think I might have addressed this in a previous video, but I don't mind to address it again. So, hello, Alan. Enjoying your videos as usual. Keep them coming. My question is about stopping and restarting a distillation. If one is forced by unfortunate circumstances to shut down a run, is there an accepted process for restarting? For example, when you have to shut down and restart later, do you need to discard another 4 shots fraction? Pretty sure that if it is very late in a run, that is not much of an issue. But if you have to shut down in late heads or early in hearts, for example, with a small amount of 4 shots or heads type things come out early in the restart. Have you ever been forced to shut down and restart a distillery run? Any other comments you have about this question will be greatly appreciated. Great question. And so yes, I have had to shut down and restart. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you guys about copper stills in particular, but really any still, and I think most of you probably know this, when you shut that still down, if it's going to set long enough to cool off, you need to make sure that it's vented, or you run the possibility of collapsing your still. It's not as much of a deal as it used to be, because a lot of people nowadays have two-way valves on their still, or a vacuum valve on their still to prevent this, but it's always, from a safety perspective, it makes more sense to vent it. When I'm doing a doubling run, if I've ever had to stop because we've lost, for whatever reason you have to stop, it doesn't matter. Yes, if I am in my hearts when I restart, I will actually make another 4 shots and typically a very small heads fraction, because what happens is all of that stuff goes through a phase change. You have stuff that's in liquid form or in vapor form that falls back into the pot. The pot is stratified by what's going to boil next, by your different order of boiling alcohols, as well as the different Azero types that have been produced. And even though we are taking off a bunch of the methanol with our 4 shots at the beginning, methanol does come out throughout the entirety of the run. So yes, I do make small cuts and small adjustments again, because once that still is shut off, everything in that liquid matrix sort of reorders itself, reorganizes itself. And it's important to make sure that you account for that. Now, granted, the heads that are there and the methanol that's there, it's in such a small fraction that overall on a large run that you're going to blend with what you've already distilled. From a health perspective, it's probably not a big deal. But from a quality perspective, it is very, very worthwhile. I have certainly had the stills shut down on me in the middle of a run many times at work and have had to deal with that. Sometimes even having to wait 2 or 3 days before I can get back to it because of some kind of big technical issue, like, let's say an electrical outage. It takes out, takes the boiler offline and all that kind of stuff. There have been times that it has certainly happened without a doubt. So really good question though. And I think I've got another one here from Bob. Let me move this paper out of the way. So yes, Alan, hey, thanks for the great talking head videos. Personally, information is power, and process videos are less valuable than information you provide so generously for the community. I appreciate that, man, and I'm glad that a lot of people seem to feel that way. I love the process stuff, but A, it's almost impossible to actually film yourself, and B, I'm trying to do some things to improve my life in the future. So recently, our friend Jesse in New Zealand dropped a video where he fermented Mountain Dew. He commented that to neutralize the negative effects of preservatives on yeast, the starting pH of the wash should be 5.5 or above before pitching. What are your thoughts on preservatives and how to deal with them? Additionally, do you think one should degas the CO2 in a carbonated beverage before pitching yeast and measuring pH? I fact-checked Jesse, and he is correct about the pH of carbonated drinks being quite acidic in 2.5 to 3.5 range. Although I have not tested it, I suspect that degassing will raise the original pH when the dissolved CO2 is off gas. Thanks again, Bob CR. So preservatives are interesting. Many of them I've not had a problem with. And I have fermented a soft drink at one point in time, or at least soft drink syrup, and really had no problem with the pH itself. So bear in mind that most of your brandy yeast in particular, or wine yeast in particular, they're fine at 3.2 to 3.5 pH. They'll take that. It's only when you're switching over to a whiskey yeast that's not adapted that the pH becomes a problem. And now here's an interesting thing about those whiskey yeast. Any of the common yeast, you can adapt. I can't talk today. You can adapt those to different ranges of pH over time, selecting them and using them on different products, right? You don't want to take something that's used to being at a 5.5 and throw it into something at a 3.5 for sure. It's going to stall it out. It's going to freak out. But over time, you can drift them to do the things that you want them to do, depending on what you want them to do. As far as degassing and raising the original pH, I don't really know that for sure. I can tell you that with carbonated wines, when I've degassed those for distillation in the past, there was no pH change for whatever that's worth. So I never saw that pH change a bit after it was decarbonated. I would probably make sure that it was flat before I fermented it, not for any technical reason I can think of, but just simply it's going to carbonate anyways. I mean, it would seem to me that it makes more sense to have that decarbonated as more of a syrup or something of that nature, right? Nothing to interfere with the yeast forming cell budding sites, things of that nature, or blowing off volatility that doesn't need to be blown off, for example, would be another example. When I did it, it was actually with a Coke syrup. Yeah, and I didn't have any problems with any of the preservatives. I didn't do anything to adjust pH or anything, but I did use a low pH tolerant brandy yeast for whatever that is worth. So I hope that answered your question. I think it probably did. I'd be really curious to try that Mountain Dew brandy. I may have to give that a go at some point in time just for shits and giggles. So anyways, guys, feel free to touch base with me. I'm glad to answer your questions. Thanks for supporting the channel. I will be trying to get a video done for a new episode of If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything to put up on the channel in the near future too. And I hope you guys are enjoying those as well. If you are interested in If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything, you can catch it wherever you get your podcast, specifically Amazon Music, Spotify, etc. I would highly encourage you guys and ask you guys to please share the links to that podcast. It's something else that I'm very, very passionate about. And if you haven't noticed, for me, the roads of distillation and the esoteric sciences and arts all lead to the same place. So anyways, guys, I hope you have a great one. Later.